Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 10. This will be an introduction to skeletal muscle tissue. Chapter 11 goes over all the muscles in the body, and then Chapter 12 will be an introduction to nervous system tissue, and these will be the three chapters that will be on your next lecture exam. So the word muscle is a Latin word for little mouse, and muscle is the primary tissue in the heart, where cardiac muscle tissue is, in the walls of your hollow organs, where smooth muscle tissue is, and your skeletal muscles, which make up nearly half of your body's mass. There's properties of muscle tissue that we have. Contractility are where we have myofilaments that are responsible for shortening of the muscle cells, and they are comprised of either actin or myosin proteins. Another property of muscle tissue is that it's excitable, which means that nerve signals are able to excite muscle cells, which cause an electrical impulse to travel along their cell plasma membrane. Muscle tissue is extensible, meaning the contraction of a skeletal muscle will stretch the opposing muscle, and smooth muscle is stretched by substances within that hollow organ, such as food stretching your stomach, urine stretching your bladder, and elasticity means that the muscle tissue can recoil after it's been stretched. There's some terminology specific to muscle tissue. Myo and mis are prefixes meaning muscle, and sarco is a prefix meaning flesh. And we'll see the prefix sarco, myo, mis a lot when we're describing different muscle tissues. Sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of muscle cells, and sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of muscle cells. The functions of muscle tissue, they can produce movement. So your skeletal muscle is attached to your skeleton, which will move the body by moving the bones. Your smooth muscle squeezes fluids and other substances through hollow organs. It helps your muscle tissues help to open and close passageways. So we have sphincter muscles, which function like a valve. They open and close to allow for the passage of a substance, and then they'll contract to close that passageway. They help to maintain your posture and stabilize joints, so they help your body to remain sitting or standing. The muscle tone also helps to stabilize many of your synovial joints, so around your knee, your elbow. The muscles will help to reinforce those joints. Your muscle tissues and muscles help to produce heat by contracting, and this helps to maintain normal body temperature. So skeletal muscle tissues are packaged into skeletal muscles, and these make up about 40% of your body weight. And these are the muscles that you guys are going to learn in the next chapter and in lab. The cells are striated, so that they have stripes, and the skeletal muscle is innervated by the voluntary division of the nervous system. And what that means is just that you will control when your muscles and body parts move. Cardiac muscle tissue is in the walls of the heart. The cells are also striated, but contraction is involuntary, meaning this will happen on a subconscious level without you knowing. Smooth muscle tissue occupies the walls of your hollow organs like the stomach, small intestines, uterus, bladder. The cells will lack striations, and they are also innervated by the involuntary division of the nervous system, which is good. You don't tell your stomach when to contract and move your food down. So in the skeletal muscle part, each muscle is considered an organ. They consist mostly of skeletal muscle tissue, and skeletal muscle will also contain connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. The connective tissue and fascicles of the skeletal muscle, we kind of get this ordering or hierarchy of how these skeletal muscles are grouped together. The sheaths of connective tissue bind a skeletal muscle and its fibers together. The epimysium is the dense regular connective tissue surrounding the entire muscle. The perimysium is the fibrous connective tissue that surrounds each fascicle or group of muscle fibers. And the endomysium is a fine sheath of connective tissue wrapping each muscle cell. The connective tissue sheaths are continuous with tendons, and when the muscle fibers contract, the pull is exerted on all the layers of the connective tissue as the tendon pulls it. Sheaths will provide the elasticity and carry blood vessels and nerves. So here we look at the connective tissue sheaths in skeletal muscle. Here we have the tendon connecting the muscle to the bone, and the epimysium is the connective tissue sheath that covers the entire muscle. So that is the epimysium. So here we have the epimysium surrounding the entire muscle. Here is a fascicle, which is a bundle of muscle fibers, and the fascicle is wrapped by the perimysium. So we've pulled out a fascicle here that's wrapped by the perimysium, and then we're going to pull out a muscle fiber from the fascicle. So a fascicle is made up of muscle fibers, and surrounding the muscle fiber is the endomysium. So again, the epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. The perimysium surrounds the fascicle, which is made up of muscle fibers, and muscle fibers are surrounded by endomysiums. Nerves and blood vessels. So each skeletal muscle is supplied by branches of one artery, one nerve, and one or more veins. Nerves and vessels will branch repeatedly. The smallest branches will serve each individual muscle fiber. Muscle attachment. So most of your skeletal muscles run from one bone to another. One bone will move and the other bone remains fixed. So the origin of a muscle is the less movable attachment. Sometimes that is called the distal point of attachment because it's closer to the point of the trunk. And the insertion is the more movable attachment on the muscle, usually the more distal, So origin is more proximal point of attachment, and insertion is more distal, more movable point of attachment. So here we have the muscle contracting. The origin is the part of the bone where the muscle will originate, usually more proximal or closest to the trunk. And the insertion will be the part where the muscle is inserted on the more movable part of the bone. So we have the origin and insertion part of the muscle, also can be named the proximal and distal. Muscle attachments. Muscles will attach to the origins and insertions by connective tissue. In the distal attachments, the connective tissue fibers are short. Indirect attachments, the connective tissues can form a tendon or an aponeurosis. And the bone markings that you all learned about and love so much are present where tendons meet the bone. So the tubercles, the trochanters, and all the crests you learned, that's where you'll have different tendons that will attach the muscle to the bone. The skeletal muscle fiber, the fibers are long and cylindrical. They are huge cells. So skeletal muscle fiber is just another word. The fiber also means cell. So a skeletal muscle fiber is the same as a skeletal muscle cell. So they're huge cells, very large diameter. The length is several centimeters to dozens of centimeters. Each cell is formed by a fusion of embryonic cells, and the cells are multinucleate, where the nuclei are peripherally located. So here's a look at a part of a muscle fiber showing the myofibrils. One myofibril is extended from the cut end of the fiber. So here we have this is an entire muscle fiber or muscle cell that you're looking at. You see multinucleuses pushed to the periphery, and you can see that we've kind of cut away a little bit so you can see what looks below the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber cell. And then we've taken out a myofibril, and a myofibril has been pulled out, and myofibrils will make up the muscle fiber cell. You can see in the muscle fiber cell, we have dark bands and light bands, and that is what gives the striated or banded appearance of skeletal muscle tissue. Those dark and light bands are colored because of the proteins that are inside the myofibril that we'll talk about. So striations result from the internal structure of the myofibrils, which is what we just said. Myofibrils are long rods within the cytoplasm. They make up about 80% of the cytoplasm, and these are the specialized contractile organelles found in muscle tissue. They are a long row of repeating segments called sarcomeres, and a sarcomere is really important to know. A sarcomere is the functional unit of skeletal muscle tissue. The basic unit of contraction of skeletal muscle, the Z line or Z disc, are the boundaries of each sarcomere. So the sarcomere goes from one Z disc to the next Z disc, and I think that's a test question. And then the thin filaments that make up the sarcomere are called actin. They will extend from Z disc toward the center of the sarcomere, and the thick filaments are made up of myosin. These thick and thin filaments are the protein filaments that make up the myofibrils. The overlap inner ends are only thin, and they will contain ATPase enzymes. Then we get to other parts of the sarcomere, which I don't ask you really more details of it, but you should know that the Z disc is from one sarcomere to the next sarcomere. So that's kind of the functional unit of that. So the A bands and the H zone are other ways to describe different parts of the sarcomere. The A bands are the full length of the thick filaments. They include inner ends of the thin filaments. The H zone is the center part of the A band. Sorry, it's a little choppy. My daughter keeps interrupting a little bit. And then the H zone is the center part of the A band where no thin filaments occur. The A bands and I bands will refract polarized light differently, and that's what gives us the striated appearance. The M line is the center of the H zone, and the I band is the region with only thin filaments. So this is what I'm describing here. And again, what you guys need to know is just that the Z discs are kind of the boundaries from one sarcomere to the next sarcomere. So that is what the Z disc is. And then you'll have H zones, A bands, and I bands that describe other different parts of the sarcomere depending on where the actin and myosin filaments line up. You'll see here that the thinner line in blue, those are the actin proteins. And then the thicker in red, those are the myosin proteins. And you can see how they're kind of overlapping. And as the muscle fiber contracts, they will slide past each other. And that's what causes muscle contraction, which we won't get into too much here. You'll get a lot in physiology, but we are going to talk a little bit about it. So here's just the enlargement of one sarcomere. Again, here's the Z disc. So the Z disc is the boundary from one sarcomere to the next. So this makes up one sarcomere, which again is the functional unit of skeletal muscle contraction. And then you have the thick filaments and the thin filaments. We have titin and other myofibrils. Titin is a spring-like molecule that resists overstretching. So titin resists stretching. The titin molecules extend from the Z disc to the thick filaments to the M line, and the two functions are to hold the thick filaments in place and also to unfold when the muscle is stretched. You don't really need to know about titin. You do need to understand the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is a specialized smooth endoplasmic reticulum. It has interconnecting tubules within each myofibril. Some tubules form cross channels called terminal cisternae, and cisterns occur in pairs on either side of a T tubule. The big thing about sarcoplasmic reticulum, and I think this is a test question too, is that it contains calcium ions. So I'll just put a star there. Sarcoplasmic reticulum contains your calcium, which is very important in order to help with muscle contraction. Calcium ions will diffuse through the cytoplasm and will trigger the sliding filament mechanism, which is contraction of the skeletal muscle. The T tubules are deep invaginations of the sarcoplasm, and this is another test question, I think. A triad is made up of a T tubule flanked by two terminal cisterns. So as we look kind of what I'm talking about here, again, this is the part of the skeletal muscle fiber, the cell, and we're pulling out one myofibril. And then we can see here the sarcomere, the Z disc to the Z disc. And within that, we have these triads. And again, a triad is made up of the T tubule and the terminal cisternae on either side. So the T tubule is in light blue, and the terminal cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum is on either side. So that makes up a triad. And then the tubules of the sarcoplasmic reticulum kind of expand over the whole myofibril. But the important thing about this triad, the action potential will travel down the T tubule and then cause the calcium to be released from these terminal cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that's what causes the muscles to contract or shorten. There's two types of contraction, concentric and eccentric. Concentric is when the muscle shortens to do the work, and eccentric means that the muscle will generate force as it lengthens, and the muscle will act more as a brake to resist gravity, and the down portion of a push-up is an example of an eccentric contraction. So the sliding filament mechanism I will briefly describe, but there won't be too many, if any, test questions about this, but the sliding filament mechanism is what explains concentric contraction, which is the ability for your muscles, again, to shorten, to do work, to move a part of the body. The myosin head will attach to the thin filament at both ends of the sarcomere, and then it just pulls the thin filaments toward the center of the sarcomere. The thin and thick filaments never shorten, but the sarcomere will shorten as they slide on top of each other. This is always initiated by calcium ions that are being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's what I want you guys to know. This is also powered by ATP, so your cells need ATP to contract. They need energy to do work. So here's a look at the thin and thick filament. You can see that the head of the myosin is attached up to the thin filament, and that will pull or slide the actin past it to create this contracting or shortening of the muscle to contract. The contraction changes the striation pattern. When it's fully relaxed, the thin filaments will partially overlap. But when it contracts, the Z discs move closer together, the sarcomere shortens, and the different bands and zones will change. So here's just a look at a fully relaxed sarcomere. So you can see here kind of how everything is kind of not as overlapped. And then the fully contracted sarcomere, you can see how the actin and myosin have overlapped, and the Z discs have come closer together as the sarcomere has shortened. Muscle extension is when the muscle is stretched by a movement that is the opposite of the movement the muscle normally produces. The muscle fiber length and the force of contraction has the greatest force produced when a fiber starts out slightly stretched, and the myosin head can pull along the entire length of the thin filament. So here's our great couple slides that explain the structure and organization levels of skeletal muscle. So pause the lecture video, use these slides to kind of study what covers the muscle, the fascicle, the muscle fiber itself, and then the myofibril and how it's made up of actin and myosin. So these 3 slides are really good at describing kind of what we just talked about. Innervation of your skeletal muscles. So your motor neurons will innervate skeletal muscle tissue to tell them when to move. And the neuromuscular junction is the point where the nerve ends and the muscle fiber meets. The terminal boutons, also axon terminals, are located at the ends of the axons, and they store neurotransmitters. The synaptic cleft is the space between the axon terminal and the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. So here we have a look at the motor axon of a motor neuron, how it kind of splits into individual pieces, the terminal bouton of the neuromuscular junction. And then if we zoom in here on the neuromuscular junction, we have the synaptic cleft, which is the space between the motor neuron and the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. So this is how our muscles get stimulated by your nervous system. The synaptic vesicles will contain a neurotransmitter called acetyl-CoA. That's what ACH is. And what happens is acetyl-CoA will be released and bind to receptors on the muscle fiber. And when that happens, it kind of changes this nervous response into a muscular response so that the muscle can be stimulated. So really quickly, these are the 3 steps of the neuromuscular junction. Really simply put, that you guys should know, the nerve impulse stimulates the release of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, which is the space. Acetylcholine will stimulate change in the sarcolemma that will excite the muscle fiber, and the stimulus is carried down the T tubules to initiate the fiber contraction. When that happens, it will cause the calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and calcium is what is needed for your muscle fibers to contract. Enzymes in the synaptic cleft will always break down excess acetylcholine to limit the action to a single muscle twitch, because we don't want our muscles constantly stimulated and constantly being contracted. Here's a look at the motor unit and how your motor neurons come out the front side of the spinal cord. We'll talk about this when we get to the nervous system. And the motor neuron will travel, and you can see here that each end, terminal bouton, each end of or branch of a motor neuron will travel to each single muscle fiber. So we can see a motor unit is one single branch of a motor neuron and the muscle fiber that it innervates. Skeletal muscle fibers are categorized according to two characteristics: how they manufacture energy and how quickly they contract. Oxidative fibers produce ATP aerobically with oxygen, and glycolytic fibers produce ATP anaerobically without oxygen by glycolysis. We have three classes of skeletal muscle fibers. You can have slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, or fast oxidative. Slow oxidative fibers have a red color because they have a lot of myoglobin. They obtain energy from aerobic metabolic reactions. They contain a large number of mitochondria. They're richly supplied with capillaries, which give them a red color, and they contract slowly and resist fatigue. The fibers are small in diameter. So you'll find slow oxidative fibers in a lot of the muscles of your posture, your calf muscles that are constantly contracting. Fast glycolytic fibers contain little myoglobin, few mitochondria. They'll be a little lighter in color, whitish. They contain more myofilaments and generate more power, but they depend on anaerobic pathways and they will contract rapidly and tire out quickly. So these muscles will not be made for endurance. Fast oxidative are more powerful than slow oxidative. They're somewhat fatigue resistant. They have high myoglobin content and rich supply of capillaries. They are oxygen dependent, and they will contract more quickly, like fast glycolytic fibers. So here's the body location and the comparison of skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Again, a good review slides here. The cell shape and appearance of the three types of muscle tissue in the body. Again, another great kind of review slides of what makes up each component tissue and the presence of myofibrils composed of sarcomeres between the three, cardiac and smooth, and then what their presence of T-tubules in the site of invagination of those T-tubules looks like. More characteristics of a comparison of skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. I focus a lot of test questions just on skeletal muscle. And here's a look at some of the regulation of contraction from the nervous system. Disorders of muscle tissue. So your muscle tissue experiences few disorders. Heart muscle is the exception. Skeletal muscle is remarkably resistant to infection, where smooth muscle problems stem from external irritants. Muscular dystrophy is a group of inherited muscle-destroying diseases. It affects muscles, and they will enlarge with fat and connective tissue as the muscles will degenerate. You have different types of muscular dystrophy, Duchenne or myotonic. Your case study talks about Becker's muscular dystrophy. They all kind of are very similar. Myofascial pain syndrome is where pain is caused by tightened bands of muscle fibers. Fibromyalgia is a mysterious chronic pain syndrome that affects women. Symptoms are fatigue, sleep abnormalities, severe musculoskeletal pain, headache. Muscle tissue develops into myoblasts. So this is how now muscle tissue develops throughout your life. Myoblasts will fuse to form skeletal muscle fibers, and skeletal muscles will contract by week 7 of development. So here's a look at how muscles form from embryonic mesoderm cells and eventually into a mature skeletal muscle fiber. Satellite cells will surround skeletal muscle fibers. They will fuse into existing muscle fibers to help them grow. I don't ask you guys a lot of muscle tissue questions. The differences in skeletal muscle between males and females. Females have a little less body mass of skeletal muscles, about 36%. Males have a little bit more of muscle body mass. And that's because of the difference in androgens, which are sex hormones. So the testosterone will create a little bit more muscle mass in males. With increased age, the amount of connective tissue increases in muscles and the number of fiber muscles decreases. The loss of muscle mass with aging occurs where you get a decrease in muscular strength by about 50% by the time you're 80. And sarcopenia is just the word for muscle wasting. So this is the first chapter. I'll see you guys for chapter 11. Thanks for listening.